Welcome all. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say that I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. We are going to be having a wonderful discussion today with Graham School instructor Jennifer Lind, where we will be examining international relations through novels, and we will be previewing a course that she'll be teaching here at the school this autumn. For those of you who are not familiar, let me welcome you to our gorgeous campus here in Hyde Park. We are having a cloudy but still beautiful day here, and finally the heat has receded, so there's some cool air to accompany the many cool ideas across our campus. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Graham School, we are the home of lifelong learning. For more than 130 years, we have been trailblazing new paths to better understanding the world and to helping individuals to live examined lives of purpose through an intellectual life. Those ways of doing it are four. We have a Master of Liberal Arts, which is among the most respected and rigorous in the world. We have a basic program where you can go deep into the great books and you can explore how those books evolve over time. We have open enrollment where you can take courses across all the disciplines of the university, and that's where Jennifer's class is located this autumn. And then we have annual programs, and actually just finished a gathering of museum professionals from around the country, a gathering of judges from around the country. And later this month, we'll begin Know Your Chicago, where you can go deep into understanding the big issues that face our region as we look to the future. But that is not why you are here this afternoon. You are here to hear from Jennifer Lind. And so I will show her on our screen, and I will introduce her as an instructor here at the University of Chicago Graham School. She holds a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University SAIS, as well as our Master of Liberal Arts here at the University of Chicago. She worked at the US State Department and the USAID in Washington, D.C., and she has had many civic leadership roles, and we're incredibly grateful for her leadership at the Graham School as well. And Jennifer, this is a very unique class that we're going to be talking about over the course of today. In my mind, it is quintessentially Graham because you are using the humanities and literature as a window in to another area and field, which is international relations. And you are bringing that together from your own graduate education in international relations and then your Master of Liberal Arts. Can you talk a little bit about how you got the idea to teach this course at the intersection of humanities and international relations to begin with?
Sure. Thank you, Seth. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm delighted. I'm thrilled to offer these courses and to bring the topics of foreign policy and international relations to the Graham community. Marrying novels with international relations, for me, it's a natural fit, especially choosing these. When I think of novels or literature and international relations, this was an easy, almost obvious choice, really, with these two novels, canonical novels, really. In addition to being award-winning, Kazuo Ishiguro won the Nobel Prize, and his novel, The Remains of the Day, won the Booker Prize. And All Quiet on the Western Front is really a canonical anti-war novel. But in addition to being of this quality, these novels, the use of fiction, the use of characterization offers us, I would say the aim of this fiction, this characterization of the authors is to capture a moment in time, to crystallize a moment in time in history. And this is an era, of course, with World War I, the interwar years, World War II, and the aftermath of World War II, creating the world order we know. To create this moment in time through fiction, through imagined stories, imagined characters, imagined communities, that borrows from Benedict Anderson in referring to nationalism. But these imagined conversations married with international relations theory, setting a framework for studying these novels with the theories of international relations, really invites readers with a window to better understand, or in a more sophisticated, more nuanced way, international relations, international politics, I would say.
Well, can we dig in a little bit to international relations itself before we jump into the novels? Because something you mentioned in our preparatory Zoom is that international relations is different from history or political science. And it is a field that has kind of come into emergence just over the last century. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the emergence of the field of IR and its distinctiveness as a discipline.
Sure. Well, it is a recent discipline. International relations as an academic field, as a field of study, was founded after World War II with really a twofold purpose. It's sort of obvious to say now in hindsight, right? To understand the causes of World War I and to prevent another war on that scale. Obviously, there's a lot of work still to be done, but it was the first university to teach courses and to offer this as an academic field was in Wales. It was actually the University of Aberystwyth. If you look that up, one of the first things that comes up is how to pronounce it. It's in Wales. And then Professor E.H. Carr, Edward Hallett Carr, who is the author of the first book we'll look at and talk about today and look at this fall, he was a professor of international relations. He was a British diplomat, a historian, a journalist, and he served in the foreign ministry during World War I, and after he served in Paris and Latvia. And his goal was, he dedicated his book, The 20 Years Crisis, to the makers of the coming peace. His goal was to understand how this global war occurred and with the goal of preventing future wars. Political science is really a field that studies government systems, politics and their consequences. History, of course, they're close cousins, right? They rely on each other. History is more than just a repository of facts. It's really alive and well with debates on sort of, and invites us to consider and debate historical events and their legacies and their consequences today. So I would say, back to international relations, it relies on history. History is like, I would say, a prerequisite for the field of international relations. Historical dates and facts and events are really important to understanding international relations. But international relations as a field, it really has sort of three pillars that hold it up. And I would say the first thing to think about if we want to understand international politics, if we want to study international relations, is when we think about how incredibly complex and complicated the world is, right? Just think of the headlines, right? It's so complicated. We need, the first thing to look at for us to understand is essential really to think about international relation theories, the great isms, as Dean Boyer at U of C also often likes to say. And that is what E.H. Carr is discussing in his book, The 20 Years Crisis, 1919 to 1939. And the first thing, the oldest, the most dominant theory in international relations is realism, which in a word is realpolitik. It's concerned with security and balance of power and making sure, if your neighbors get strong, you need to be stronger. And Carr is advocating for that. And he's saying that in the interwar years, there was too much of the opposite IR theory, IR views, which would be idealism, which he calls utopianism. Utopianism, liberal idealism, global institutionalism, like we think of the League of Nations and the UN, those things are kind of all part of the liberal wing of international relations. You kind of break that one into three: the idea of democratic peace theory, democracies don't go to war; economic intercourse. Roger Angell wrote a very famous book called The Great Illusion that said if you have enough economic intercourse, you won't go to war. And then the third thing is these international institutions. That sort of makes up the idealists that are in tension with realism. But those two big isms, those two big ways of thinking and sort of grouping international events, we have to add a third into the mix. And that is another ism, that is nationalism. And that's a term that's really thrown around a lot today, right? We see that in the headlines, we see that in the news. And nationalism, that's a big factor in this equation, and it can be really a force for good. Nationalism is how countries hold themselves together. It's like a glue that holds together a country. How do you build a nation? I like the term better that George Washington used. George Washington used to talk about the need for the cement of interest to get to how do you hold together 13 disparate colonies? They weren't even colonies then. George Washington, he knew the country physically better than any of the other founding fathers, without a doubt. From New England to what was the Western frontier then, to the Carolinas. In the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, George Washington was often thought, now he was like the James Bond of the 7 Years' War. In the Revolutionary War, he was constantly shot at and never hit. right? He wasn't like Monroe, who died still with the bullet in his shoulder 50 years after the war. So he knew that to build a nation, you need somehow to have a cement holding a nation together. And we do that by creating, sometimes it's obvious, sometimes, geography puts us together, but more often we create narratives together. We create stories. And many times that can be a force for good. An easy example is like the World Cup last year in Qatar. Half the stadium was Les Bleus, dressed in blue, cheering for the French, and the other half was having light blue. And I think we saw someone from Argentina, light blue and white shirts, right? That's nationalism in all the positive senses. But of course, in the novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, we'll look at that's nationalism that go without checks and balances, without liberalism, and without those ideals and morals in check. It can just go it can just go to the extremes. And that's what Erich Maria Remarque's novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, is really. It's a scathing critique of nationalism run without any checks and balances.
Well, so I just want to ask one more question, then we're going to dive into each of these novels further, Jennifer. And it's a Graham question, because you just described international relations.
Oh, sure.
We pride ourselves here, obviously, on the great books. And, many of those, even though they were written before the field of international relations, are absolutely essential to what then has become international relations. I'm thinking of Thucydides, I'm thinking of Machiavelli, I'm thinking of Hobbes, and many of their theories, right, ultimately become core to theories in international relations. And I'm curious if you could just briefly speak to the role that these classic texts and many times philosophical, texts play in the field of IR.
Sure, that's actually a really good point, because when we think of the field of IR as being founded immediately in the years immediately after World War I, IR students tend to begin with Thucydides, right? Who was a 5th century Athenian general. He commanded a fleet in the Peloponnesian War, which lasted 30 years. He was a historian of ancient times. His book that is so famous is The History of the Peloponnesian War. That was based on his personal experiences and on eyewitness accounts. So while he's documenting the 30 years of warfare, Thucydides asks questions that are the essence, really, of international relations. He's asking time-honored, more than documenting the war, or I should not say more, in addition to documenting the 30 years of warfare between Sparta and Athens, he's asking us questions that are time-honored. What is the nature of a great democracy? What is the measure of a great democracy? What is the measure of a great leader? How do you define great? How do you define leader? Is human nature good? Is human nature bad? How do we check when human nature is not good? Why do nations go to war? How do we solve these problems? Those are really the questions that Thucydides poses. And I would say that Thucydides' writings undergird international, they bolster and they help us, they're tools to help us examine international relations. Machiavelli, 16th century diplomat and historian in Italy, we certainly think right away of The Prince, which is a slim novel, and that he's basically saying it's all about preserving the state. He is definitely a realist through and through, and he's just saying that morality and virtue and all of that, that's fine, but like Reinhold Niebuhr would say, right? First comes security, and then there's plenty of room for morality if you're first secure. So it's not hopeless. There is morality, there are values and virtues, but first you need to focus on your security. Machiavelli, Taylor Swift has a song called Mastermind.
I know, where Machiavelli makes an appearance.
In a sense of a strategist, right? So in popular culture, I guess he's in popular culture. If Taylor Swift is singing about him around the world. It's a negative sense of sort of dog eats dog strategy. And I guess Machiavelli, we can use him as we see fit to guide our sort of studies in this realm. Who else? You mentioned Thomas Hobbes. Well, when I think of Hobbes, I think of Leviathan, 1650-ish, 51, 52. Hobbes basically, we all know that sort of nasty, brutish, and short term of Hobbes, but he's basically talking about the state of nature. This really, all three of these that you mentioned really get to our belief in human nature. Are humans good? Their capacity for evil? Can human nature change? Thomas Hobbes, I think of Leviathan, I think a little bit of like Lord of the Flies. he's basically saying, left in the state of nature, humans would be like Lord of the Flies. Life would be nasty, short and brutish, and I forget the exact expression. So what he says we need is an enforceable, authoritative figure to enforce that social contract. Because it's the idealist would say, well, we can have social contracts, we can have the League of Nations, we can have nice institutions and trade institutions, and then everything will be fine. And the realist would say, wait a minute, you need an enforceable Leviathan, an enforceable authority to make sure everyone follows the rules, because the state of nature is such that people won't necessarily act in a kind, good way if it's not in their self-interest. So I feel like it kind of gets to the heart of human nature, but international relations is guided and rests on some of these historians and philosophers. These are all before the Enlightenment, when values come along, such as sort of liberalism and democracy, and that, as I know Professor Palmer spoke recently about this, the idea that actually everyday people can participate in government. There's no natural inherent hierarchy. Everybody's equal. Everybody can participate, and that sort of is in competition with these realist ideas.
Well, so I think you beautifully set the table on how international relations as a field has developed, and the many ways in which it connects to philosophies that we read regularly at Graham, and even how it connects to the great Taylor Swift. So I want to move us into the novels themselves and think about, really the role that those plays in illuminating international relations theories. And I'm curious if we could go novel by novel, because there are three, two novels and then, a historical piece in your class on the syllabus. And if you could just talk about maybe the time period in which that book was written, how it offers a unique glimpse into the understanding of IR at the time, and perhaps even their relevance today, because many of these novels are still read and we're still interpreting the world through their narratives. And so can we start with The Remains of the Day, which, as you mentioned, was by, a Nobel Prize-winning author, Kazuo Ishiguro?
Sure. Well, absolutely. All three of these books are widely read today. They're on curriculum, they're on syllabi from ninth grade through, adulthood. They're definitely canonical works. But to start with The Remains of the Day, well, when I read anything, the first thing I want to do is read about the author, right? Where and when the author lived when he or she wrote the piece. But Kazuo Ishiguro was born in Japan and raised in England. His parents moved to England when he was 5 or 6. He was born in 1954. He wrote The Remains of the Day, was published in 1989. That's a very important date in these discussions in the field of international relations and foreign policy, which we'll connect with later. The story is an English butler who takes a summer drive in England in the summer of 1956. And he's telling us, as a narrator, he's reminiscing about decades of service to his aristocratic former, who's since deceased, his former employer, who was the lord of an estate called Darlington Hall. He's an unreliable narrator, reminiscing and questioning his service to the British establishment. This novel there's so much to unpack here. It's really, Ishiguro very subtly introduces us to what I would say are these competing ideologies of international relations. It's set at a glance, it looks like it's set in the interwar years, and it's about British and French and diplomats from around Europe, and not just diplomats, leaders, elected, appointed, business people. It's about their desire to appease Germany. And it's his recollections about those meetings. He was a butler in the background, overhearing, because he was in the room serving, the arguments for appeasement. And he considered them fine, upstanding citizens. And he's doubting he's wondering if it was misguided moralism that these appeasers were advocating for. Well, that's at a glance, but when we dig deep, the story actually takes place in 1956. That's the year, and this is the summer of 15/6. The butler's driving, reminiscing, and reflecting on that era of the interwar years in Britain. 1956, we often don't think of it now. that was the year of the Suez Crisis. And the Suez Crisis, in a nutshell, was really, in a nutshell, it marked the end of the British Empire. Nasser in Egypt, well, Egypt was a British protectorate. Great Britain and France relied on the Suez Canal for their economies, for their trade to their colonies throughout the world, to their empires, to India in the East, in Asia. So Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. France and Britain kind of secretly brought Israel in and went to war to forcibly keep control of the Suez Canal. The US, this is 1956, the US and the USSR were already in a Cold War, which I like to think more of as an era than a war. The US had just finished in a stalemate, a 3-year war in Korea. The French had just been defeated in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, Indochina. The French were completely bogged down in Algeria. That would be a terrible war that would go on until 1962. This was the twilight of the European colonies, their imperialism. But the Suez Crisis, basically President Eisenhower called the Prime Minister of Great Britain and said, stand down. And they did, and they went home. And this marked, and this is what the Butler is referring to and debating and questioning with both the people in the 1930s and his employer who has purchased the estate in 1956. He's questioning the role of the United States, the role of Great Britain, the wisdom of their choices. In this context, in 1956, where Ishiguro sets his novel, and the whole setting is showing the declining power of Great Britain as it relates to the rise, but really the decline of the British Empire and the rise of the American one. So that's kind of when you really do a deep dive, which we always do at the Graham School, into our source, into our literature, there's a lot to unpack here. And I'm just touching the surface.
When I want to go into other novels, but I see a question in the chat that directly relates, which is from Clinton Stockwell. Was that also the date of the Soviet incursion into Hungary?
Yes. And in fact, it was the exact same time. So the Suez Crisis, thank you, Clinton. The Suez Crisis was the fall, it was about a month, the fall of 1956. And the called a revolution, the incursion in Budapest, the Soviets crushed a strong resistance, a strong revolt in Hungary that lasted a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks in October, November 1956. That's an important point. So this wasn't just it was the end of the British Empire. And this was 10 years after the Cold War began, because it really began before the World War II was over. This was the two superpowers. And because Egypt was really trying to kind of play nice with both. This was the two superpowers who had already been in Cold War proxy wars, saying to France and Britain, we're in charge. The world is now, we're top dogs. It's a bipolar world. The two of us are in charge. You're now on the B team. We're on the A team. And in addition, very important, and you can see it, and we will do it this fall as we really fine-tooth comb. You know, I feel like Ishiguro chose many of his words like a poet. We'll see. This gets back to our story about nationalism. This was a huge moment for pan-Arab nationalism, Egyptian nationalism. You know, at a glance, France, Britain, and Israel should have decimated Egypt. But it was a new world order, and the USSR and the USA had the final say. And one more thing, it marked, after this, Great Britain, and this was a British Empire, right? Like when World War I began, they had the biggest navy in the world. This was the former British Empire. And now, after the Suez Crisis, Great Britain could no longer, and you could argue still, make any major foreign policy initiatives without the consent of their best friend across the Atlantic.
So I want to make sure we come briefly to the other novels, because they're really interesting. All Quiet on the Western Front. Can you give us just a picture of when that was written, how it played out at the time? It's
sure. Sure. And I assume, I wonder if many here today are more familiar with this novel that was published in 1928, less than 10 years after the end of World War I. Erich Maria Remarque, and I do like to mention something about the author because I just think it's so important to know something about the writer when we read anything. He was actually born Erich Paul Remarque Remarque, because his grandparents, who came from France to Germany, changed their French last name. We know him as a German, but he was of French origin. His grandparents came to Germany as adults. They changed their last name from Qe to RK to blend in Germany. And our author, Erich, he was born Erich Paul Remarque. He changed his last name back to the French origin before he published this book after World War II, after his service. And he took his mother's middle name as his middle name in honor of his mother, who died right after World War I. People died after the war. There wasn't much food or healthcare to go around. So Erich Maria Remarque served in World War I briefly. He turned 18 and later in the war in 1917 and only served less than a year, and he was wounded. And he wrote this novel based on his own personal experiences in the trenches, that 400 or so miles of zigzagged the border from Switzerland up to the North Sea. After in the trenches, he was in the hospital for a very long time. And then he wrote this novel based on accounts of his, as he would use the word, comrades, of their accounts. It's, as I said earlier, it's a scathing critique of nationalism, right? It's also told by a first-person narrator. But in this case, our main character, the narrator, Paul Baumer, is a reliable narrator, and he tells it in present tense. Ishiguro was very famous, if you've read other novels of his. He likes to go back and forth in time. He's very flashbacky and very into reminiscing. But Remarque, his main character, Paul Baumer, is barely 18 when he serves in the war. He tells it in present tense. It's cringeworthy. It's difficult to read. He goes into horrific details of trench warfare while criticizing unchecked nationalism, right? He and his friends, they were children. They were in high school. Some of them lied about their age so they could serve in the war. They were told by a very jingoist, nationalist high school teacher that to serve their nation, they should go to war. And he realizes later, this teacher, his only knowledge of war was abstract, right? And so he questions this sense of nationhood in the novel.
Well, and then we come to the 20 Years Crisis, which is an interesting one in your syllabus because it's not a novel, but it does really help us to understand international relations. And in many ways, it brings to the fore a lot of the ideas that are embedded in these two other novels. And so just want to make sure we talk a little bit about that one, and then we'll come to your questions in the audience momentarily.
Oh, thank you. I can see lots of questions and lots of people signing in from all sorts of countries. Thank you. Well, E.H. Carr, his book was published, this is very noteworthy, in September 1939.
Yeah.
A date we all know. His book, he uses the term utopianism and utopian. His book claims that World War, so he's not so, I mean, it's looking at the cause of World War I, but he's looking at international relations in general and providing theoretical frameworks to understand the countless sort of factors into the equation that go into international relations, trying to put them in a framework so we can understand them. And according to Carr, he is a harsh critique of post-World War I order. He was at the Versailles Conference until June. They were there almost a year, till June 1919. He basically posits in this book that the entire the world order constructed after Versailles is inherently flawed. It's hopeless. It's a pipe dream. It's like the League of Nations, for example. He thinks it's a pipe dream. They're nice ideas, these utopian or liberal institutional ideas that simply don't accept or understand the reality of the chaos and insecurity of the world. And what he's saying is not that we should be completely like Machiavelli or Hobbes and have all realism and all nationalism. He says we need a balance, and his word is utopianism, but he thinks we need a balance so that one or the other doesn't run unchecked in order to avoid war. And he dedicates his book to the makers of the coming peace.
Well, what an ominous dedication. Can we come to the bigger idea that's behind your course. So you've described these two novels and then, given us context on the 20 Years Crisis. And I guess a question would be, why do you think there are insights that the novels might offer that we wouldn't just get from, let's say, a classic textbook approach to international relations? So, why novels as a way into this subject when, we could just look at the treaties and the more kind of direct factual
Yeah,
information.
sure. Well, many reasons. I'll give, in the interest of time, I'll give one example only, because we definitely want to get to your questions. I would give one example from the remains of the day. So the butler, and it will be wonderful to dig into this throughout the autumn course because there's just so much to unpack. The butler served for decades a British establishment figure in the aristocracy who was an unofficial, and Carr gets into this, the amateur or professional diplomats, who this Lord Darlington, he proactively, very actively worked to establish for the government to pursue policies of appeasement vis-a-vis Germany. He wanted to not just make nice with Germany, he wanted to build Germany up. He wanted everything that Carr shreds, really. He wanted economic intercourse, economic integration. He wanted to build up their economy. He wanted liberal institutions that he thought would make everybody, follow the rules. He wanted these, what he advocates for are the hallmarks of idealist theory, of idealism. That's the character Lord Darlington. And here's where we kind of marry characterization and fiction with IR theory. Those are his hallmark, his policies are the hallmarks of IR liberal idealism. Yet the sources of his views do not in any way match with liberalist or internationalist sentiment. The sources of that come from a sense of noblesse oblige. He thought everything should be done in secret, which was the exact opposite of Woodrow Wilson, who thought everything should be done in open air, right? No secrecy there. He thought it was based on his personal experience in the war. And very importantly, which Ishiguro does subtly, but very importantly, it's also based on his close friendship and relationship with people throughout Europe and in Germany. And he invites the German ambassador to his home to say, don't worry, let's not go to war. His very dear friend, one character in the book, is a dear friend who dies by suicide in Germany after World War I because the conditions were so harsh. And this brings up so many areas of sort of IR theory and fiction together. And 2 points, I guess, specifically. One, as much as World War I was a total war, a global affair, truly a lost generation, the World War I was a family affair. These were cousins. When he invited the Germans over, they were cousins. Kaiser Wilhelm II, we don't often remember, his grandmother was Queen Victoria. These were cousins at war. The British, Victoria and Albert had 9 children, most of whom married European royalty. Cousins at the time of World War II were from Russia to Portugal and in between. So he, through this novel, we're invited to consider and reflect on these international events in myriad ways.
That's fascinating. So we have many questions in the chat that I want to get to. We'll start with Patrick Hanley, who says, as a Booth Paris alum, I'm delighted to see Graham offer courses related to IR and foreign policy. This is fantastic. So thank you, Jennifer, for being part of the reason we're able to do that. Professor Lin, does your interpretation of these novels and history lead you to see the nationalist impulse and associated tensions as inherent to a global system of nation states? Is cosmopolitanism a dead end?
Is what a dead end?
Cosmopolitanism.
Yes and no to the 2 questions, I suppose. I think nationalism is a natural force. I think and I know Professor Peggy Mason in neurobiology would say we're evolutionarily inclined to interact with those who are similar to us in various ways. So the sense of imagined communities, it's a very famous book by Benedict Anderson on nationalism. I do think it's natural to want to people to, and we think of our own lives, to be around those who speak our language, who look like us, who have similar ways of life, right? And so, and for security purposes, nationalism makes sense. It's not all negative. But is cosmopolitanism dead, sort of internationalism, global institutionalism? I think rather than dead, I would say it makes me think of something Machiavelli writes about. I couldn't say the quote, I'm paraphrasing. Machiavelli would say, history does not repeat itself, history rhymes. We see patterns and structures throughout history. So cosmopolitanism, global institutionalism, that ebbs and flows, it rises and falls. For example, in Danny Roderick, an economist at Harvard who wrote an excellent, well-known book called The Globalization Paradox. I forget the subtitle. In 2009 or 2010, he wrote a book. He was kind of shooed off the stage at Davos, essentially, figuratively speaking. He said, look to the West, this globalization effort, this cosmopolitanism, this global institutionalism, be careful, you're raising millions out of poverty throughout the global South with global institutionalism, with this globalization, yet you may wreak havoc in your own West, he said to the Western prosperous countries, this is going to hurt your middle classes. And indeed, parties on the left, the liberal, meaning left of center in Western Europe and North America, in the 90s, they didn't like globalization, right? It hurt unions, it hurt workers. Whereas now, to Patrick's question, a good question from the Harris School, globalization is now very much embraced by political parties left of center as an antidote to rising nationalism. So it kind of, these tensions, or I would even say competitions between these isms, they have different purchasing power in different eras.
We have a next question from Greg Gosick, who asks, extending on the view of Clausewitz that war is politics by other means, are there any literary examples of competing fictions in which authors who were contemporaries advocated opposing sides engaged in the same conflict? And maybe I can just broaden that question a bit to say, as you wrote your syllabus, were there some other novels you considered that you thought of as being really interesting glimpses into international relations?
Yes, with an exclamation point. I can think of, a half a dozen courses that would be interesting to do. Two authors who were contemporaries, I would think of maybe The Quiet American and The Ugly American, that looked at, advocated different policies, suggesting for the United States and France, this is sort of post Dien Bien Phu, but advocating different policies in Indochina and Vietnam that the United States could have, should have pursued. There's so many novels. It would be wonderful to do a series of sort of studying international politics, international affairs through novels. It would be wonderful looking at the Global South. We could look at Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Those two would pair very well. And of course, we could kind of, I saw someone here on the call from Croatia. It'd be wonderful to look at the history of the Balkans and look at Ivo Andrić's historical fiction, The Bridge on the Drina. I forget when that was published, but I think it was the 1950s or early 60s. He was a Serbian diplomat. So there's a world of literature, if you're interested, that we could definitely do courses on.
Your fellow instructor, Clinton Stockwell, has the question, what do you think is the utility and the necessity of a League of Nations, or today the United Nations, which Wilson advocated, but today one president did not want to be involved in, and another president wants to use it to pursue its own nationalist ends? So yeah, I guess as you think about where we are with our global system, especially in light of the current war between Russia and Ukraine, any thoughts on kind of how to look at the utility and necessity of these global institutional structures, and maybe what these novels might say about them today?
Well, if we had another 2 hours, definitely they're worthwhile. As Reinhold Niebuhr would teach us, or even as Machiavelli would point out, we don't give up on morality. We don't give up on these institutions. the League of Nations had many good ideas, and many things about the United Nations comes out of the League of Nations. While the US did not join this organization it proposed, a total of 63 nations were part of the League of Nations, not all at once. Germany came in and out, Russia came in and out, but there are those who benefit from, on a very micro level too. We could look throughout the global south at areas that benefit from all sorts of United Nations programs. But I would say to kind of both the novels and E.H. Carr and Machiavelli and Thucydides, who we talked about earlier, it's a balance, right? It's this need for security, but bring in our values and liberalism to check and balance. Because if we have all one or the other, we won't avoid war. So I think it's a balance, and always striving for these institutions, and these liberal institutions serve a purpose, but not to be too utopian about it, as Carr would say, and meanwhile recognize the chaos and insecurity, the insecure nature of the global order, because there's not an international police force, right? The UN blue helmets, ask people in Srebrenica or in Rwanda and Burundi, they didn't do any good, right? So we want to have a realistic balance.
When speaking of real and realpolitik, Jim Runyon has a question. You mentioned trench warfare, which is a significant part of the current war in Ukraine. Can you comment on that conflict and the role of nationalism and realpolitik in it? And no intimidation intended, Jennifer, but I just want to acknowledge in our virtual room here is John Mearsheimer, who is arguably one of the most significant voices and thought leaders on this topic globally. But no pressure as you answer this question.
Well, we can have a debate next time. So the question's Ukraine and how this all relates.
Yeah, how you think about the role of nationalism and realpolitik in it, and if there is, ideas that come out of these novels or the 20 Years Crisis that, you feel like has relevance to understanding what's taking place there.
Well, it's with a heavy heart that we discuss all of this, right?
Yeah.
The novels bring front of mind how individual lives are destroyed,
Yeah.
and countries are destroyed. Empires fell apart. But I think for Ukraine, we look at there'd be a liberal view and an idealist view, or a realist view and an idealist view of what's happening in Ukraine, and how, if we in the US or how the world should respond. We've seen it's actually pretty easy to write checks and send weapons, right? It's much harder. Where are you willing to go fight and die for what? Not many people other than Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for Ukraine. It's much easier to send, as we did in World War I and World War II for the first half, 2/3 of the war, send all the weapons and food and supplies and money you've got. Sending people is a different story. I think for Ukraine, we have to think, people talk about winning. Well, what does that mean? Who wins? What does that mean? Who loses? The obvious, for sure, losers, no matter what happens, is Ukraine. The country is just being destroyed. Regular, everyday Russian people are dying. I think an interesting thing to think about is who wins in Ukraine. China. This brings this global order back. China, right, is meanwhile a winner, right? If with the USSR and the USA, that bipolar competition, that Cold War is over, right? Our next competitor is China. China is on the rise. Well, who's benefiting from the war in Ukraine? Certainly China, right? Just like they benefited when we were bogged down for 20 years in the forever wars. I think that's a big picture way of looking at what's happening.
We are running up against time, but I do want to just ask a few final questions. You are teaching this course after having had a number of beloved courses at Graham. Do you want to just talk a little bit about some of the other courses you've taken to teach,
Sure.
and then how you approach teaching? And
Sure.
I will say for everyone listening, we will follow up with the syllabus for this course, just if you're curious for your own reading interest. But yeah, Jennifer, let me turn that to you.
Well, a recent course that was just really wonderful, and it touches on a lot of what we've discussed today, was looking at the foundations of US foreign policy. In a nutshell, we took these isms, these international relations theories and founding principles of the United States, this realism, idealism, unilateralism. We looked at concepts such as Americans believe in American exceptionalism and manifest destiny, immigration, the centrality of work. We looked at these themes and founding principles behind the founding of the United States, and we debated how these principles guided our foreign policy to really answer the question, how in 1783, how did 13 disparate colonies strung along the Atlantic seaboard, how did they become a global superpower and defeat the British Empire twice in 115 years? And we looked at original documents through those eras. And that was a really exciting course. I would say, and I know we're running close to time, I think an approach to teaching is at the Graham School is always original documents, always diving deep, always as interdisciplinary as possible, always a debate-centered class, a discussion. President ABC engaged in policy XYZ. Was that a good idea? Was that a bad idea? Good for who? Bad for who? Always debating. And I think that, Bertolt Brecht wrote a poem I love, and it's called, he was German, A Worker Reads History. And he's saying, instead of just studying the Colosseum, let's study the lives of the people who built it. Because there's so many particulars in all of this that we're talking about, yet there's so many questions. So instead of sort of taking these classes and coming away with kind of a textbook memory of the events and dates of World War I and World War II, dates and events are important, right? The Lusitania sunk, but we didn't enter the war until 2 years later. Those dates are important, yet it's more the general questions of this time period, of the era, of the world wars and the aftermath. Coming out of a course like this, I think the aim is more to have more sophisticated, more nuanced questions about these topics. And while certainly these questions, most of the time they're unanswerable, they nevertheless bear careful consideration in our spirit, joint inquiry and doubt that we pursue.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about one other item as our closing question, which is not only are you teaching this autumn, and you are going to have, from what the chat is showing, a very enthusiastic group of students, you are also leading a tour as part of the Graham Symposium, which is coming up on October 7th, and I'll put it in the chat. Do you want to just describe the American Century Scene in Hyde Park tour that you're curating?
Sure. And if you want to share, first, there's a painting by John Gast that we can quickly share that gets to this. This is a painting by John Gast that was painted in 1872. He was commissioned to advertise to US settlers, European settlers, to move west. And this shows what we'll be talking about on our tour. This basically shows exactly what we've been talking about, these isms. She represents liberal, and she represents enlightenment, she represents progress. It's called American Progress. She has a book, she's holding telephone wires, railroads, etc. That's all the liberal idealism. Those are the virtues and the morals that we hold ourselves high to, that we state we are founded on. On the other side, she's heading west. It's darker. How do we portray Native Americans? They're on horseback, not on wagons and trains. It's dark, it's negative, it's dangerous. There's that realpolitik. And it begs the question, were we founded on sort of realism and realpolitik and security, our conquest of the continent? Or as we like to say, we settled the continent and brought progress. So this painting kind of cuts to the heart of the competition between these values and principles that our country is founded upon that we can debate on this tour. And there's one more picture to show. This tour, so we're doing a tour October 7th on Hyde Park in the campus, highlighting areas of the University of Chicago on our campus that led towards what was dubbed the American Century by Henry Luce, the journalist, in 1941. He was the son of a missionary. He thought we should go globally and spread our democratic Christian, he would say, values. This is a statue of the Republic. In her right hand, and her left hand first, she's holding a staff with it's actually a plaque, it's a cross that says liberty, that's partially obscured by a laurel wreath. Liberty, victory, she's representing in one hand. In her other hand, and first of all, she's facing west, by the way. This is 1893 at the Columbian Expo. We have, choose your verb, settled the continent, conquered the continent. We are now looking west. We're taking Alfred Thayer Mahan's advice and building a navy and going to Asia. And in her right hand, she's holding a globe. And this is really key to our story of US foreign policy. She's holding a globe. This is unilateralism. She's not with any allies. She's taking George Washington's advice, and we're going solo, unilateralism. And we've got a bald eagle, which is almost sort of like the French Marianne. That's our symbol. But that eagle is resting. That eagle's wings are wide open, ready to take on the world. So she's actually holding all these competing isms, the liberalism, the values, the liberty, the cross, the unilateralism, the world expansion is a nice way to put it. And so we'll explore all these themes with Professor Paul Post, October 7th at the Graham Symposium.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for being a huge part of our world on many levels. But don't just take my thank you. I'll read from the chat. Vercel says, splendid discussion and fascinating perspectives. Thank you. Beth Fox, fantastic presentation. Bravo, fascinating from Jean Bishop. And we would be here all day if I were to read all of the great comments, but they all have a similar theme. We've learned a lot from you. We're grateful, and we look forward to continuing that learning this autumn. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Jennifer, for enlightening us. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.